Tim Cockerill, former lawyer turned author and National Trust volunteer, expert in heraldry, also has an encyclopedic knowledge of the history of Weston Colville. We met in the church on a bitterly cold January morning.
Weston Colville, a very remote village, even up to the last century, but it goes back a long way. The village is about 3,225 acres, I think, and it goes from 6 miles right up the top here, right down to 6 Mile Bottom, and we're about 10 miles from Cambridge, we're about 6 miles from Newmarket, and about 6 miles from Haverhill. So originally the village was Weston, and it was when the Colvilles bought or acquired the estate that they added Colville to it, which was quite a common thing to do, and we've had it ever since, of course. The population really didn't alter terrifically over the centuries. At the time of the Domesday Book, there were about 200 people here. At the time of the 1851 census, it was 574, I think. And then moving on to 1996, there was about 430. And I haven't seen any figures then, but I don't imagine it's greatly altered.
What would the village have been like at some of those times that you just mentioned?
I don't think it would have altered greatly. It's been agricultural until the beginning of the last century. And it was only really when the Hall family sold up in 1912 that everything changed.
So in amongst all that, what about the history of the church? I mean, do you know when the church was built?
Well, the church was certainly built in the 11th century, but what you see today is medieval really. It's mainly 14th century with Victorian additions. You will see on the left is a Victorian tower, which was rebuilt after it collapsed. In the middle, the nave and the porch are medieval, and then the chancel, which we're now sitting in, is Victorian. The vestry, which is just behind, is again 1870, I think. There were various restorations, mainly after the tower fell down in 1823. I don't know quite how it happened or why it happened. There wasn't an earthquake or anything, but it was very quickly put up again. The story was, which I think is probably apocryphal, that the architect who was doing it had two plans. One was for a church tower here and the other was for a water tower, and we got the water tower by mistake, but I'm not sure that's actually true.
Can you tell us about the medieval glass?
It would have been funded by the families whose coats of arms are in the windows, and I think there are about 4 of them. I don't think it was actually ever broken. It was just
Old.
It was just old, and the weather over the centuries gradually eroded it until it got in a very precarious state, I think.
And just going back a few steps, you mentioned 4 landowners.
Well, 4 manors. 2 of them are in Weston Colville, and 2 of them are in Weston Green. And the 2 in Weston Colville are on the site of what is now Weston Colville Hall, and the other one is at Moat Farm, which of course still has a moat, but there's nothing to show where the house was. Then we go down to Weston Green, and one was called Leverett's, which I think was near Pound Farm, and the other one was Moynes Hall. There's just a ruined barn there now, no sight again of any big house or anything. And we don't really know quite who lived in those, but they probably weren't the lords of the manor, they were probably their tenants. But they ruled it through presumably bailiffs and staff who would tell all the locals what to do. There wasn't really, I don't think, a resident squire here living in a big house until the Carters came here in the beginning of the 18th century. The Hall family, well, they started off as Carter in the beginning of the 18th century, and then they changed their name through a marriage to Hall. He was a London draper, John Carter, and he just bought the estate because he thought he ought to have a country estate and pretend he hadn't made his money in trade in London. The church is really devoted. In a way, it's a kind of sort of mausoleum to the Hall family, because wherever you look, there are monuments and stained glass windows and things like that. Well, we now go and have a look at the great east window behind the altar, And this window was erected in the 1880s by the widow of Major Charles Hall, who was the squire for not very long really. He succeeded his brother General Hall in 1871, he died in 1880. And the inscription of it by the widow is rather affecting and quite unusual really, even in the Victorian times. And what it says is this: "This window is erected in memory of Charles Hall, late Major, HM's first Lifeguards, by his fondly loved and devoted wife, Anne Tyree Hall." So it shows how fond she was of him and how much she missed him, I think. General Hall was in the Lifeguards, like his brother Major Hall. They were what I would call ceremonial soldiers. They never went abroad, they never had to fight a war. There's a medallation of him in the window in the church, wearing a Scottish plaid for some reason. I think that was because his wife was Scottish, possibly, because he had no Scottish blood in him at all, as far as I know. But after he died, she gave two very generous bequests to the village. First of all, she gave £3,000 to found the Major Hall charity. And then later on, she gave £6,000 to augment the stipend of the vicar or the rector of Weston Colville. Now, those figures in today's money are something like 400,000 or that kind of figure. I did look it up. Absolutely enormous sums of money. So there was obviously a great deal of wealth there.
So going on to W.H. Hall.
W.H. Hall is an interesting character. He was one of probably the two most influential or interesting people to do with Weston Colville in the 19th century, the other one being the poet Withers. He was born in 1836 and he was the son of Major Henry Bullock, but his mother was a Hall. Now, when he was born, there was absolutely no prospect of him ever inheriting the Weston Colville estate. So after going to school at Rugby and then Balliol College, Oxford, he decided he wanted to go to the bar to be a barrister. Having qualified, he found it incredibly boring, and he was of an adventurous disposition, so he then became a war correspondent. He went off to Italy and actually took part in a cavalry charge with Garibaldi and was under fire. For the rest of, for the next few years anyway, he was a war correspondent in the Franco-Prussian War and was actually awarded the Légion d'honneur for his part in, reporting really and helping the wounded, apparently. And then, surprise, surprise, in 1871, he inherited the Weston Colville estate, Major Charles Hall, who we've just mentioned. He was already in receipt of the other end of the estate, the 6 Mile Bottom estate, which incorporated the Wilbrahams as well. And it was only later on, when Charles Hall died in 1880, that William Henry Hall succeeded to the whole estate, which was over 7,000 acres. And he was required to change his name from Bullock to Hall. Sometimes to inherit an estate in those days, you were required to change your name and assume the arms of the family who you succeeded.
Can you tell us about the fatal shooting accident down at 6 Mile Bottom?
Well, that took place in 1885 when Mr. Hall was out shooting with a party, and he was given a gun by his loader, and he wasn't very happy with it. He thought he'd given him the wrong gun, so he started to fiddle around with it, and unfortunately it went off. Not only did it go off, but it blew the best part of the leg off one of his employees. I think it was a shepherd, and he was absolutely horrified by this, of course, and the chap was eventually taken to hospital, but there would have been quite a gap, and he very unfortunately died 2 days later, leaving a wife and several young children. And Mr. Hall not only had to face an inquest about this, because they thought that, obviously he didn't do it purposely, but still there could have been charges of something like manslaughter, I suppose. And but more importantly, he immediately said that he would look after the wife and children for the rest of their lives and provide for them. which was all he could do, really. I mean, there wasn't much else he could do apart from show sympathy, which I'm sure he did. And it was said later on by his descendant that this was probably one of the reasons that led him to leave Weston Colville. But I think he never really got over that. And he felt ashamed of it, I think, because he was an experienced shooter, and it should never have happened. I mean, it was a very silly thing to do, really. I know we all do silly things, but this was really unforgivable.
Yeah. So one of the other famous people from Weston Colville is our poet, J.R. Withers. I wonder if you could tell us a bit, because there's a plaque to him.
Indeed there is, yes, in the church, a little brass plaque. And he was born in the village in 1812. His father was a shoemaker, but not a very successful one. There was no education in the village, so through his mother, who was obviously a bit more intelligent, he learnt to read. But he was sent out into the fields to collect stones and scare birds, probably at the age of about 10. And later on, he got a job in a market garden in Fordham. Because they couldn't afford to have him educated, even if there had been a school here. Mrs. Weston, I think it was, realized that he was writing poetry and needed help, really. And by then he'd compiled enough poems for a little volume, and she financed that, and it was published, and he became known as the Cambridgeshire hedge poet. He was a sort of like John Clare in Northamptonshire, but not as famous, but he was quite well known. In fact, he was so well known that Charles Dickens helped him and gave him some money, and Queen Victoria herself sent him £50, which was a lot of money in those days. And he was able, after that, he had a family, he was able to sort of subsist in Fordham. He'd left the village here to go to Fordham and live there in the rest of his life. And then he died in 1892 at Fordham, and there's a stained glass window to him in the church, and he's buried in the churchyard, and his descendants in the 1990s got together a collection of his ephemera and his poems, and there's a permanent exhibition to him in Fordham Church, which is well worth looking at.
And there we ended our conversation with the poetry of J.R. Withers and a glimpse at the colourful lives of the Hall family, who were so influential in the development of the village, especially in the 19th century.